Hi, my name's Sean Coates. I'm a freelance CG generalist, and inside of this tutorial we're going to be focusing on the procedural techniques inside of Mari's node graph. We are going to create photorealistic human skin using a purely procedural workflow inside of Mari, and the benefits of this are you have more control over the surface texture that you are creating, and you can't really make mistakes as you can always go back and chop and change your node graph rather than actually baking mistakes into layers or the paint buffer inside of Mari. I also find that when you work procedurally, you do have more control over what you're trying to create because you're not working from an image, you're working from your eye and you're working from reference, but you're not projecting, an image right on to the canvas. Therefore, you're not really tethered to it. So the end result will be a good base layer, a good base texture for skin. And really, if you wanted to go in and hand paint in more kind of finicky details and project kind of scars and creases and a bit more breakup, you could go and do that. You could go ahead and hand paint some details in that you might not be able to achieve procedurally. But I think you'll be pleasantly surprised with what you can achieve with just a procedural workflow. We have a lot to get through, so we best begin. Firstly, I'm going to hit Tab on the keyboard and type in Arnold's standard surface. This will create the AI standard surface that's native to Arnold. I'm picking this one because it's the one I'm most familiar with. However, you can pick any shader you like. In order to create any texture or any material, we need to create a shader because here we can define the surface properties like how reflective a surface is or how bumpy it is. So it's the starting point for any material development. So the first step is to simulate the subdermal layer of skin. So this is the fatty and bloody reds and yellows that hides under or behind the top layer of skin. So we're going to hit Tab on the keyboard and create a color node. This is a node that contains a solid block color. I then hit 1 or 2 to view it in the viewer. You can use any of the numbers on your keyboard to assign different viewing points inside of your node graph. This becomes very useful when you want to compare and contrast two different points in your node graph. I use number 2 as personal preference, but you can use any one you like. And then over in the node properties, I'm confronted with one option, which is just the color, and I'm going to change it to a deep burgundy blood red. I'm then going to accept that and hit Tab again and type in cloud. This will create a cloud node. A cloud node is a procedural node inside of Mari that creates random procedural cloud-like patterns. And in the color A, I'm then going to select a similar blood-like red color, and in color B, I'm going to select that fatty kind of yellowy color that you would expect to find on the subdermal layer of skin. The subdermal layer of skin is the kind of undercoat or the underlayers that sit behind the pigment. So in the node properties on the cloud, we're going to scale it down to 0.3, and then we're going to turn the roughness up to 0.65. This gives it a more veiny organic feel. We can then hit Tab on the keyboard again and type in merge to create a merge node to merge these two nodes together. So we're going to plug the constant, the color, into the base and the cloud into the over. With the merge selected, I can hit 2 to view it. And over in the node properties, I'm going to leave the mode on normal and turn the blend amount down to 0.31. This will knock the yellow and the red in the direction of that bloody burgundy color that we chose, giving it a more flesh-like feel, so it's more similar to something we would expect to find under a layer of skin. With all 3 of the nodes selected at once, I can hit Tab on the keyboard and type in backdrop. This will encase all 3 nodes inside of a backdrop node that we can title. Backdrop nodes are a very good way to stay organized inside of the node graph, as they allow you to label certain sections and certain nodes inside of your script. They're especially useful when creating larger scripts, as it means you can locate sections very quickly and you won't get lost. I'm then going to hit Tab on the keyboard again and create another color node. I'm then going to hit 2 to view it. This node is going to control the base pigment of our bust. This could be any color you want according to the ethnicity of the character you are texturing. So for the bust I'm texturing, I'm going to select a brown pigmentation for the skin. I'm then going to hit Tab on the keyboard again and create a cellular node. We're going to be using this node a lot in this tutorial as it's a very useful tool when creating organic textures. It already has that coming together like pattern of cells that you would expect to find on an organic texture such as skin. So I'm going to change the color B to a dark brown so it sits more naturalistically on top of the diffuse pigment that I've already picked. And then I'm going to scale it right down. This is then going to add this kind of microscopic level of detail or grain to the surface texture and quality of the skin, just so it's not a flat color to start with. So if we zoom in on the viewport, once we have settled for a size of 0.04, we can really see these microscopic organic details starting to happen. I'm then going to hit tab on the keyboard and create a merge node. I'm then going to plug the color, the pigment into the base and the cellular noise into the over. Inside of the node properties, I'm going to change the mode to multiply. With the merge node selected, I'm then going to hit 2 so I can see it in the viewer. And I'm going to turn the blend amount down to 0.65. So holding Alt and right click, I'm going to zoom in on the viewport and you can begin to see this kind of microscopic detail appearing. I'm quite happy with how that's blended, but again, as I'm working procedurally, if I want to go back and change anything later, I can do that as it's a totally non-destructive way of working. With all 3 nodes selected, I'm going to hit tab on the keyboard and create another backdrop node just to stay organized. I'm going to make this backdrop node a little bit larger because we still have more nodes to add to this section of the script. I'm going to remove the color from it and create another backdrop node just specifically for that. And I'm going to title this one Pigment, as it's just holding the pigment color. And the larger one I'm going to title Dermal. So we're then going to move on and add some larger details to the surface of the skin. So we're going to hit tab on the keyboard and type in Purlin. And with this node we're going to create moles. A Purlin noise is often used in visual effects and texturing to create and add realism to a texture or an effect, as it has a very natural feeling. It can be manipulated in any which way you choose. So inside of the node graph, I'm going to go and select the color B to a dark brown like that of a mole, and I'm going to scale it right down to about 0.165. We're then going to hit tab on the keyboard again and create a levels node. A levels node is one of the most effective ways inside of Mari to manipulate the appearance and form of any noise or procedurally generated pattern, as it allows you to change the range and values of the whites, the midtones and the blacks inside of any texture. So with the level selected, I'm going to hit 2 to view it, and I'm going to change the input level of the white to 0.015, and I'm then going to change the input level of the black to 0.9. And then we start to see these mole-like dots appear. There is a grayer texture when we zoom in, like some finer stuff. I'm just going to leave that in because I think it's going to add another layer of breakup to the diffuse channel. If I turn the blacks down, the moles become bigger and more frequent, and if I turn it up, they become less frequent and smaller. So I think we're going to settle around 0.9. So now we need to merge these moles back into the previous pigment that we created. So we're going to hit tab on the keyboard and create a merge node. We're going to take the output of the previous node and plug that into the base, and the output of the levels and plug this into the over. We're then going to double click on the merge node, and inside of the node properties we're going to change the blending mode to multiply. This will then layer just the moles and the darker areas over our previous existing procedurally generated texture. So if I hit 2 to view the merge, you can then begin to see the effect. So I'm going to change the blend amount to around 0.34 and zoom in and check if that looks any good. I think we could up it a little bit more, make them a little bit more opaque, so I'm going to up it to 0.4. But you can really begin to see those misshapen, not perfectly circle moles appearing. So we're going to hit tab on the keyboard and create a cloud node. With this node we're going to create lighter, soft blemishes on the surface of the skin. So hitting 2 to view it, I'm going to go inside of the node properties and change the size to 0.25. And I'm then going to change the roughness to 0.13. Back inside the node graph, I'm going to hit tab and create another levels node. So I'm then going to put the output of the cloud into the input of the levels. Inside of the node properties, I'm going to change the input level of the white to 0 and the input level of the black to 0.1. And here we can get these white splodges kind of appearing, but they have a very hard edge at the moment. If we zoom in, we can see they have a very, very hard edge. So we need to find a way to soften these. So back in our node graph, we're going to hit tab on the keyboard and create a bake point. Bake points are used for a number of things inside of the Mari node graph. You can use them to optimize a scene that is very heavy on the processor. So anything downstream to it, your computer, once it's baked, will no longer have to process and compute the nodes to the left of it. So here I'm going to hit bake to give that effect inside of the node properties. You can also use bake points to export flattened textures in any format that you choose. But we're going to use this bake point to blur and soften the edges of the white blemishes that you can currently see in the viewer. So we go to the filter tab inside of the node properties and hit edit filters. We're then going to select blur and we're going to change the radius to 10 and hit apply. So with the bake point selected, I can then zoom into the viewer and see that the edges on these white blemishes have been softened. So if we do before, and it's really, really hard, after, it has a nice fall off. So now we have that kind of gradation, we now need to merge this back into the previous layers. So I'm going to create a merge node, and I'm going to take the output of the previous merge and put it into the base just like last time, and the output of the bake point and put that into the over. I'm then going to double click on the merge node to open it in the node properties and change the blend mode to lighten. I can then view the merge inside of the node graph, and you can see these white blemishes that are really garish and they're nowhere near realistic. So we need to turn it right down to a minuscule value because we want it to be a very subtle effect, much like a very subtle blemish on the surface of the skin. So I'm going to turn it down to 0.01 because I think that's the appropriate amount. If I zoom in and check it out, it looks good to me. So I'm now going to do a little bit of script organization and create another backdrop node for the nodes that I use to create the mole layer with. And I'm going to also do the same for the nodes that I just created to make the blemishes. So finally, we can add the subdermal layer with the dermal layer by creating a merge node. So I'm going to hit tab on the keyboard and create a merge node. And I'm going to take the output of the subdermal section and put that in the base. And I'm going to take the output of the dermal section and place that into the over. I'm then going to select the merge and hit 2 to view it. And then inside of the node properties, if I turn down the amount, you can see those yellows and reds of the subdermal coming through. We want this to be very, very subtle and not very overpowering. So we are going to change the amount to 0.99. And there we can see just a very subtle breakup in color. And I'm just going to go back and make one final change in the merge of the light blemish section. I'm going to change the amount to 0.005 just to knock it back a little bit more because I want it to be even more subtle than it was. So we're now ready to view the dermal and subdermal layers of skin in the diffuse color of the Arnold standard surface. So we're going to take the output of the last merge and plug it into the diffuse color. We're going to hit 2 once we've selected the Arnold standard surface to view the shader. In the viewer, we're going to see that the surface quality is far too shiny. So I'm going to double click on the Arnold standard surface and hit 2 to view it. And then inside of the node properties, I'm going to turn the roughness up inside of the specular section to 0.65. I'm going to go back into the node graph, hit tab, and then create a cloud node. I'm going to use this cloud node to break up the specular weight to kind of emulate a layer of grease, or just to break up the sheen to make it a little bit rougher in areas and a little bit shinier in areas. So by plugging the cloud into the specular weight and then clicking on the Arnold Standard Surface shader and hitting 2 to view it, we will see how the cloud is affecting the specularity of the skin. So inside of the node properties, I'm going to turn the size down to 0.34, and I'm going to turn the roughness down to 0.27. Then in the B color, I'm going to change that black to a light grey, something much closer to color A. And what this is going to do is it's going to close the gap in the difference between the rougher areas and the shinier parts of the bust. As the lighter the colour, the more reflective the map will be. So we're now ready to move on to the subsurface scattering part of the tutorial. So subsurface scattering is a very integral part of making any human or organic thing looking like it's alive, because what it does is it allows light to refract through the flesh, so this creates a glowing effect that really makes stuff look like it's alive and made of flesh. So we're going to hit tab on the keyboard and create a color node. So we're then going to double click on it and head over to the node properties, where we will click on the color and reselect the color to a more muted red, something a bit more pastel-y. Once you're happy with your color, hit OK. And then hit 2 to view the color in the viewer. We're then going to hit tab on the keyboard and create a 2-point gradient. This node is very useful when working procedurally, as it allows you to create masks without using a brush tool or a paint stroke. So if I select the 2-point gradient node, I am then confronted with its node properties. And here, if I hit these pluses, I can create 2 locators. If I then hit the P next to the plus, I can then move the locators, and here we can see it's a linear gradient, so it's just A to B. We want to change the mode to radial. This will now act as a more spherical gradient, and it's more appropriate for what we want to use it for, as we want to target specific areas of the bust, for example the ears and the nose. So this takes a bit of adjustment, but we hit the P to move the locator, as I already said, and we want to get one locator on one side of the ear, so the A locator just outside the ear, and then we want to get the B locator just inside the head on the other side of the ear. And then what will happen is the colour will fade out between the 2 points and only touch the edge of the ear itself, like so. Now you will have noticed that inside of our node graph we can no longer see our nodes. So what we need to do is we need to go inside of our Objects tab on the right hand side and just click on the object, and it will take you back to your main script. So now we're back here, we're going to hit tab and we're going to create another 2-point gradient, and we're going to repeat the process that we just did with the last ear, but we're going to do it for the left ear. So we're changing it to radial, and we're going to hit plus every time we create a new 2-point gradient to create 2 new locators. Then we hit the P again and we move each locator into the appropriate place, so either side of the ear. I'm then going to merge these 2-point gradients together. So I'm going to create a merge node and plug the output of the first 2-point gradient into the base and the second one into the over. In the node properties, I'm going to change the mode to lighten, and then we can see them both in the same space. I think the one on the, I think the left ear needs a bit of adjustment, so I'm just going to go back in and I'm just going to move it so it's more symmetrical with the right ear. Yeah, I think that's a bit better. Okay, and then finally we're going to go back into our node graph and we're going to create one more 2-point gradient, and we're going to aim it at the nose. So the process is exactly the same. We double click on it, it comes up in the node properties, we hit the 2 pluses to create new locators, and we put them either side of our target area. By hitting P, it allows us to move the locators. And obviously we want to change it to radial. So I'm just going to fast forward the adjustments I'm making to point the 2-point gradient node at the nose. But when you're using this tool, you should really get to know it and get to know how the two points relate to one another, because once you learn it, it's very simple and it's a very useful tool when working procedurally. So we're going to go back into the node graph and create a merge node to merge the nose mask with the two ears. So we're going to plug the nose into the over and the two ears into the base. We're then going to go over to the node properties and change the mode to lighten. So now if we view that merge, we can then see all of the masks together, and I think I'm happy with that effect. So we're ready to move on. So now I'm going to go and select all of the nodes I've just created, and I'm going to hit Tab and create another backdrop node. I'm then going to double click on the backdrop node, and I'm going to change the color to red, as it's for the red and blushing part of the texture. You can change the colors of backdrop nodes to help you find things even faster in a very busy script. So I'm going to change the name to Blush and Subsurface Scattering, so SSS. So we're now going to click and hold the color node that we made inside of the Blush and Subsurface Scattering section, and we're going to bring it up towards our Pigment section of our script. We're then going to hit Tab on the keyboard and create a merge node. So we can plug the Pigment color into the base of the merge, and then we can plug our blushing color into the over. And if we view that, we will just see the blushing color coming through everywhere. So what we're going to do is we're going to plug the 3 2-point gradients that we made earlier in the Blush and Subsurface Scattering section into the mask. So we're going to take the last output of that section and we're going to plug it into the mask of the pigment. And now you can see just the affected areas. So we're going to turn the mix down so it's a much more subtle effect, to maybe about 0.222. So now we can check to see how this looks when we are viewing the shader itself. So I select the shader and I hit 2, and the effect kind of isn't that obvious. So we can go back into the merge and turn the mix up to 0.76, and then you can begin to see it a little bit more. So now we can move on to adding the actual subsurface scattering effect to our network. So by hitting Tab and typing in levels, I create a levels node, and I'm just going to take the last output from the subsurface scattering section and plug it into the input of the levels I've just created. I'm then going to double click on the shader, and inside of node properties go back into the subsurface scattering section, and I'm going to click on the color and I'm going to select a more pastel-y kind of muted red, and then we can go ahead and take the output from that levels node and plug it into the subsurface weight. This will then use all of the 2-point gradients and the levels as a mask for the subsurface scattering. And then with the levels selected and hitting 2, we can view it. And I'm going to lift the blacks just a little bit, just so the subsurface scattering effect hits the whole bust and not just the targeted areas, giving it more of a flesh-like realistic feel. And I think the nose is a little bit too red, so inside of the node properties of the levels, I'm just going to turn the white down to 0.813 just to knock the effect back a bit and calm the redness down. So we're now going to move on to the next section, and this will be the bump mapping. So we're going to hit Tab on the keyboard and create a backdrop and title it Micro Bump. This is an integral part of the process because it's where all the surface quality of the skin is going to occur. So the pimples, the wrinkles, the creases, and we're even going to raise the moles that we made earlier. So we're going to go back into the node graph and hit Tab, and we're going to create a cellular node. So the idea here is we want to create very small pores, so tiny little holes that are dotted all around the surface of the skin. So we're going to scale it down inside of the node properties to 0.08. We're going to zoom in and we can see already that we can see these little dots occurring in this more kind of organic and irregular way. And we're going to then change the color A to black and the color B to white. So we're going to inverse the coloring. And then we're going to hit tab on the keyboard again and we're going to couple this with a levels node. So we're going to plug the output of the cellular into the input of the levels. And inside of the levels node, we're going to turn up the input level of the mid values to 0.82. And this is going to create a more dotty, spotty kind of effect. And then we're going to hit tab on the keyboard again and create another cellular node. We are then going to view the cellular node, and inside of the node properties we're going to change the size to 0.15, and here we can see a slightly larger variation of cells appearing, and we're going to couple this with another levels node just to push it and manipulate it a little bit more. And we're going to use this second cellular node to add a bit of breakup to the first, really, just to add a little bit of variance. So inside of the levels, we're going to change the output black to 0.3. And inside of the input levels, we're going to change the white to 0.6, the mid to 0.45, and the black we're going to change to 0.2. And here you can now see a more spotty kind of dotted effect occurring. So now we need to merge these two together. So we're going to hit tab on the keyboard and create a merge node. We're going to plug the first levels into the base and the second into the over. We're going to double click on it, and inside of the node properties we're going to change the mix amount to 0.1. So now if we hit 2 we can view the merge, and we will see that the larger cellular node will be overlaid onto the first. And all this is doing is it's adding a bit more breakup and changing the regularness in the height of both the pores and the skin. Creating a breakup in the regularness of any organic texture is always going to help believability, because the brain is built to pick up on regularities. So our eyes are very good at picking up when something looks far too regular and a little bit uncanny. So we're then going to hit tab with all the nodes selected and create a backdrop node, and we're going to title this node pores. We're then going to move on and hit tab on the keyboard and create another cellular node. We're then going to view the node, and inside of the properties we're going to change the size to 0.1. With this layer of nodes we are going to create the creases and the folds that you see on skin. So we're going to create a levels node, and we're going to plug the output into the input of the levels. And inside of the node properties here, we're going to change the output black level to 0.2. We're going to change the input white level to 0.6. And we're going to change the mid level to 0.45. And finally the black level to 0.2. So we're now going to create a merge node to merge the current nodes with the pores in the previous section. So we're going to take that output from the last merge, plug it into the base, and plug the levels into the over. And inside of the node properties, we're going to change the blending mode to screen, which is found under the lighten category. And then you might think, oh, this doesn't look much like creases. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn the mix amount down to 0.1. And then what you will see is you will see those kind of pocketed cell-like outlines that you see on the surface of skin. I'm just going to turn the blend amount down to 0.15 just to knock it back a tiny bit. And then I'm going to go back into the node graph and create another cellular node. This node I'm going to scale down even more than the last one, but it's going to be acting in a very similar vein where it will be creating skin creases. So inside of the node properties, I'm going to view the cellular node, and I'm going to turn the size down to 0.045. And then if I zoom into the viewer, you can see the really small effect happening. I'm going to take the output of the cellular node and plug it into the input of the levels. And inside of the levels, I'm going to change the black to 0.2, the black to 0.2 again, and then the mid to 0.45 and the white to 0.6. Then we're going to hit tab on the keyboard to create a merge node, and we're going to repeat the process that we did before and take the output of the previous merge and plug that into the base, and then the output of the levels and plug that into the over. We then double click on the merge and go inside of the node properties, and inside of the mode we're going to change that to lighten and then screen. And we're then going to turn the blend mode down to 0.15, and then if we zoom into the viewer and we view the previous merge, we can't really see the bigger ones coming through, so we're going to go back into the previous merge and we're going to turn that up a bit, and then you can begin to see those larger creases be a bit more prominent behind the smaller one. We're then going to select all of the nodes that we've just made, and we're going to create a backdrop node and title it creases. So now we're going to move on and try and create some larger pores or some larger dents in the skin that are just going to sit across the nose and both cheeks. So we're going to hit tab on the keyboard and create another cellular node. Then we're going to hit tab again and create another levels node. And we're going to plug the output of the cellular into the input of the levels. We're then going to double click on the cellular node, and inside of the node properties we're going to scale the size down to 0.15. And then we're going to select color A and turn it to black, and then we're going to select color B and turn it to white. So we're going to inverse the colors. We're then going to double click on the levels node and then change some of the settings in here. So we're going to lift the blacks to 0.2. We're then going to lift the mids to 0.6. And I'm then going to turn the whites down to about 0.656. And now you can see they're a little bit more dotty, but I feel like pores are a bit more independent of one another and there's less overlap. So I'm going to zoom into the viewport and I'm going to just use my eyes to make some adjustments until I can find a middle ground where they're not overlapping so much and they seem to be kind of dots independent from one another. So I think I'm nearly happy with this. So I'm going to set the output white level to 0.75, the output black level to 0.15, the input white level to 0.7, the mids to 0.7, just higher than the white really, and then we're going to set the black to 0.18, and then you will get these kind of smaller dots that are still bigger than the smaller pores that we added earlier, and they all seem to be a little bit more independent of one another. So we're then going to hit tab on the keyboard and create a merge node and do the same thing of joining up the older merge into the base and the current levels into the over. We're then going to change the blend mode to screen, and then if we zoom in we will now see these white dots kind of sitting across the whole head, but we only want it to appear on the cheeks and the nose rather than the whole bust itself. So we're going to have to create a mask for this merge node. So we're going to hit tab on the keyboard and create a 2-point gradient node. This is exactly the same process as before, but I'll run you through it anyway. We're going to create 3 of these, one for either cheek and then one for the nose. So we're going to hit the 2 pluses to create the 2 new locators for this node, and we're going to change the mode to radial. We're then going to hit the P to move our locators, and here we're going to try and aim for the right cheek. So we're going to move it just ahead of the right cheek, and we're going to move the locator B just behind it. This process is quite fiddly and always takes a bit of adjustment, but I think I'm happy with this for now. So I'm going to move on and create the second 2-point gradient node, and then I'm also going to create the merge that we're going to use to merge them together. I'm then going to change the settings to radial, create our 2 locators, And there I forgot to hit P, so I was actually moving the object. I hit the P and then I can move the locators, and now we're going to aim for the left cheek. So I'm then going to plug the output of both 2-point gradients into the base and the over of the merge, and we're going to change the blend mode to lighten. And here I can see they're not quite equal, so I'm going to go back into the first 2-point gradient and match it up with the second one, because I think I prefer the placement of that one. This is one of the beauties of using this instead of a paint tool, is it's so much easier to adjust and get right, and you can adjust it an infinite amount of times without having to erase anything, because you're just simply moving the mask as opposed to having to hand paint anything. So finally I'm going to create my last 2-point gradient node, and I'm going to add it to the nose area. So again, radial, create your 2 locators and hit P to translate them. So once you make these adjustments and you're happy with the location of it just covering the nose and maybe a little bit of the brow, and create a merge node. So we're going to hit tab and hit merge, and we're going to plug the output of the previous merge into the base and the new nose 2-point gradient into the over. We're then going to change the mode to lighten and view it, and here we can see all 3 of them working in the same space. And this is where our larger pores and our larger dents in the skin are going to hit. So we're going to take that output and we're going to plug that into the mask of the large pore section that we made previously. Now we're going to select all of the nodes that we just made, and we're going to create a backdrop node to stay organized. We're going to title this Large Pores Mask. And then we're just going to move this up, and we're also going to select the large pore nodes, and we're going to do the same there, and we're going to create a backdrop node just so we can make adjustments if needs be. So just to check that we have the desired effect, I'm going to select the large pores merge node and I'm going to view it. And then I'm going to view the previous merge to see the difference. And I can see these white kind of dots just appearing on the nose and the cheek when I toggle between them. But so far in this bump map, the pores are appearing white and the wrinkles are also appearing white, and everything else is kind of darker. And if you know anything about the rules of bump mapping, then the darker tones inside of a bump map are normally the things that go inward. So what we have to do is we have to invert our bump map. So what we're going to do is we're going to hit tab on the keyboard and create an invert node. And we're going to take the last output of the merge node and put it into the input of the invert. We're then going to lift the invert up towards our shader so we can plug it into the bump section. I'm looking through the options on the shader node and I cannot see an option for bump. So this means I must have made a mistake when selecting the shader. So I'm going to hit tab on the keyboard and I'm going to type in Arnold Standard Surface, and here I'm going to be confronted with 2 options. Before I picked the one without the shader network, so we need to make sure we're selecting the one with the shader network in brackets. I'm going to hit enter and that's going to be created, and now you can see that list is a tiny little bit longer and you have bump, vector and displacement has been added. So we are going to seeing as we need to use the bump, we are going to switch over all of our inputs. They're virtually the same, we're just going to switch them over, and then we're going to plug the invert into the bump. But this also means some of the settings we are going to have to change over. So in the specular, I'm going to copy paste the roughness from our original shader and paste that in, so it's now 0.65. And then the other thing I can notice in the viewer is that the nose has gone white. So I need to change the subsurface scattering color back to that pastel kind of red it was before, because it just looks weird, doesn't it, with a white nose. So I'm going to go inside my Arnold Standard Surface settings in the node properties, and inside of the bump I'm just going to turn it off so I can preview the subsurface color a little bit better, and I'm going to change that back to that kind of pastel-y red that we had it set to before, rather than white, which makes no sense at all. Okay, and now we're back to where we were. We're then going to go into the bump section inside of our shader, and we're going to set this to an appropriate scale. So inside of the bump weight, we can turn it up really high and get a ridiculous effect, or we can turn it to a more subtle setting such as 0.02. And there I think that's a little bit too smooth, so I'm going to turn it up a bit to 0.03, and now we're getting that really subtle kind of skin-like surface quality with the very slight bumps and creases. Can zoom into certain areas to have a look, and even on the nose we can zoom in to see if those larger kind of holes and pores are there, and I can see some of them occurring, so I'm fairly happy with this so far. So now we're going to move on, and we're going to go to our invert that's plugged into our bump, and we're going to create a squiggle node. A squiggle node is another procedural kind of pattern that can be used when working procedurally. We're going to use it to create a larger kind of net of breakup in the surface quality of the bump map. So here you can see it's quite large, and it looks like quite a hard line as well. It literally does what it says, it creates squiggles. So I'm going to turn the size down to 0.35, and then I'm going to create a merge node because we need to merge this in and over. So I'm going to plug the output of the invert into the base, and I'm going to plug the output of the squiggle into the over. Then we're going to change the blend mode to multiply, and we're going to turn the mix amount down just enough so we can see these black veins running through our bump map. And what this is going to do is it's going to give that kind of organic, irregular breakup, and it's going to make the bump map a little bit smoother in areas and a little bit rougher in other areas, but not too smooth, you know, for it to not be effective, but just a tiny little bit to, you know, add to believability and add that breakup that we're looking for. So in the viewer, I'm going to view the shader, and I'm just going to give it a quick inspection. I'm just going to speed through this. Yeah, it looks not bad to me. And then I'm going to create a backdrop node to encompass and encase all of the nodes that we've just created. And I'm going to call this one Bump Breakup, because that's exactly what it's doing. It's breaking up the bump map. Okay, so now we're ready for the next step. And what we're going to do is we're going to add our moles to our bump map. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to go up into our script from earlier, and we're going to find where we put the moles in. So as we've been so organized, we can easily find where we have put the moles. So I'm going to go back down here where my bump map is, and I'm going to create an invert node. So if we go up to our moles section and we view the levels inside of our moles section, we can see the moles are black and the surrounding is white, and what we need is we need the opposite of that. So we need the moles to be white. So I'm going to take the output of the levels and plug it into the input of the invert. So now if I view the invert, it will obviously invert the color, and I think now we're going to have to create a bake point to blur and soften the edges of that, because it's a little bit too harsh. I think there's not enough fall off for a nice, even, realistic bump. So we're going to hit bake, and then we're going to go into the filters tab, and we're going to hit edit filters. Then we're going to select blur. We're going to put it to 6, hit apply, and then view the bake point. And then here you get this softer kind of bump map appearing, which is going to be much nicer. So now I'm going to hit tab on the keyboard and create another merge node. We're going to plug the output of the merge that's plugged into the bump into the base, and we're going to plug the output of the bake point into the over, and then we're going to plug this new output into the bump. And we're going to change the mode to lighten. And then finally we're going to turn the mix amount down to 0.95. So there we can see our moles are in the bump map. So I'm going to hit 2 to view the shader, and we should now see the mole appearing, and where the light is kind of reflecting off of it, it's now having its own form rather than being completely flat on the surface of the skin.
So we can then create a backdrop node for the mole bump by selecting both of the nodes we've just created and typing in backdrop and then titling it mole bump. So now we're going to create some pimples on the surface of the skin, just some light little bumps and lumps. But for this, I want to be able to squash and stretch the 3D kind of texture in the X, the Y and the Z. We have to create the following 3 nodes. Firstly, I'm going to hit tab on my keyboard and I'm going to type in position. Then I'm going to hit tab again, I'm going to type in vector and hit enter to create a vector node. And then I'm going to type in multiply to create a multiply node. Then I'm going to take the output of the position and plug it into A and the output of vector and plug it into B. And then this setup here will allow you to control, squash and stretch any texture that you plug into the output of the multiply using the node properties inside of the vector node. I'm then going to shift select all of these nodes and hit Ctrl G to group them. I'm then going to click on the group and inside of the node properties I'm going to change the name to scale because that's precisely what this grouping of nodes will do. So I'm then going to hit tab on the keyboard again and create a cellular node, and I'm going to plug the output of the scale into the position of the cellular node. So then if I click on the cellular node and I go inside of its node properties and I change the size inside of the node properties, you're not going to see much happening because we need to make some changes inside of our scale group.
So with the group selected, hit Control and enter.
And then the nodes inside of the scale will appear in a separate tab under the node graph. And then inside of here we're going to double click on the vector and we're going to change the Y value first, and this will stretch everything in the Y. So now we can go back into our cellular node and we can change the size and you will actually see a difference now. But obviously we're not looking for a stripy pattern, we want it to be more similar to pimples. So we're going to go back into the scale tab in the node graph and we're going to change some of the properties inside of the vector node. So we're going to stretch the X up to 0.5, and then if we change the Z value we really don't see much of a difference in the squash and the stretch of the texture, so we're really mainly concerned with just the X and the Y. I'm fairly happy with this, and I think the pimples are going to be a little bit longer on across the forehead and the front of the face and down the neck than they will be on the side of the head. So I'm going to head back to the main node graph and I'm going to hit tab on the keyboard and create a levels node. I'm then going to plug the output of the cellular node into the input of the levels. I'm going to select the levels node and hit 2 to view it. And inside of its node properties I'm going to change the mid value to 0.85. I'm going to change the black value to 0.3. I'm then going to double click on the cellular node again and go back into its node properties, and I'm going to scale down the pattern a little bit because I think the circles that we're seeing there, they're not quite pimple size, they're a little bit bigger, so we're going to settle for 0.09. And then I'm going to select color A and I'm going to turn that to black, and I'm going to then select color B and I'm going to turn that to white because we want the pimples to be coming out of the bump map and not in. I'm going to go back into the settings and scale them up a tiny little bit because I think that was a little bit too small. Sorry to go back and forth, but you know, it's part of the process, is eyeing things up and trying to get things to the size that you want them to be. So we now need to merge these pimples back in over the rest of our bump map. So we're going to type in merge and we're going to take our last merge in our line and plug that into the base, and we're going to plug the levels output into the over, and then we're going to plug this merge's output into the bump of our shader. Then I'm going to double click on the merge itself, and inside of the node properties I'm going to go to the mode and we're going to change that to screen. So then if we click on this shader node and hit 2 to view it, we may be able to now see some pimples occurring on top of the skin. So now we're just going to stay organized and create a backdrop node by going back into the node graph and selecting all of the nodes we have just made and typing in backdrop. Inside of the node properties, we're just going to title this section Pimples. So finally, we're moving on to our last detail, which will be the wrinkles and lines that you get across your forehead and on your eyes. So I'm going to select the scale grouping in the pimple section and copy paste it by hitting Ctrl+C, Ctrl+V, and then I'm going to hit tab in the keyboard and create a cloud node. Inside of the cloud node's properties, I'm going to select color A and I'm going to inverse it, so I'm going to turn this to black, and then color B I'm going to turn to white. I'm then going to plug the output of the scale into the positioning of the cloud after viewing the cloud node. And then we're going to enter into the group node by hitting Shift and Enter with the node selected. So then inside of the vector node properties, we are going to leave the Y at 1 and we're just going to really manipulate the Z and the X. So we're going to set the X to 0.225. So the noise is starting to stretch across the forehead and the face, which is what we want. And then I'm going to come back into my cloud node and I'm going to scale it down to about 1.86, 1.89. I'm going to turn the roughness up to 0.568. So around 0.6 will work. Then I'm going to go back into my vector node and I'm just going to try and get the stretch to work even better than it is. So in the settings, I'm going to leave the Y where it is and I'm going to move the Z around. The Z won't really do too much. It's more the X that we're focusing on here. And I think that's looking like it might start to work. So with these settings, obviously, you don't have to stick exactly with mine. You can change them a little bit depending on what kind of effect you're going for. These are just kind of a ballpark or something that may work. So after a bit more adjustment, the X value is 0.088 and the Z value is 0.361. The numbers are a little bit awkward, but as I say, they don't have to be exact. Then we're going to hit tab on the keyboard and create a levels node for the cloud to be plugged into. So inside of the levels node properties, we're going to click on it and we're going to change the mid value to around 0.85, and then we're going to change the input black value to around 0.3. And there we're getting these kind of white lines appearing that look to me to be a little bit like wrinkles on a forehead or something, like the creases that would occur. So now I'm going to hit tab in the node graph and I'm going to create an invert node because we want the whiter streaks that look more like the creases to be black. So now we're happy with the patterning. We can now merge this back in over into our bump map. So what we're going to do is we're going to hit tab on the keyboard and create a merge node, and we're going to plug the output of the invert into the over, and we're going to plug the merge just above this one into the base. And this output is going to then go into the bump inside of the shader. So inside of the node properties, I'm going to change the blend mode to multiply, and then only the black streaks, the creases, will show up over our already existing bump map. But here, there's too many, and it's going throughout the whole head, and we only really want these creases to exist on the forehead and maybe a little bit on the eyes and the eyelids. So we need to make another mask. But before we go ahead and do this, I'm just going to select all of my nodes and create a backdrop node, and inside of the properties I'm going to title this section Wrinkles. So now we're going to go ahead and make the mask. So I'm going to hit tab on the keyboard and create a 2-point gradient node. This time we're only going to create one because we're just going to aim at the forehead and maybe some of the eyes and the bridge of the nose. So I'm going to double click on it, and it's the same procedure as last time. I'm going to create my two locators and then change the mode to radial and then hit P to move them. So after a bit of adjustment, we're going to get the locator A just in front of the forehead and the brow, and we're going to put the locator B on the other side of the forehead and the brow, so there's a bit of fall off between the 2 points. And here it's beginning to look quite good. So once we're happy with the placement of this, we can then go back into our node graph and plug the 2-point gradient node into the mask of our final merge. And then if I view the shader, we can see that there are some horizontal creases and wrinkles appearing on the forehead. Although they're appearing, I think the effect could be pushed a little bit further. So I'm going to create a levels node and I'm going to boost the whites inside of the 2-point gradient to allow more of that effect to come through in the mask. So inside of the levels properties, we're going to change the mid value to 0.387, and this will lift the whites and make it more apparent. So then if we go back and view the shader, we can see now in the forehead area we are getting more apparent and more obvious crease effects, and also on some of the eyelids you can also begin to see the effect occurring a little bit more than it was before. So I think here we're basically finished and we've only got one more thing to do. Okay, and the final thing I'm going to do is create bake points and put them in between every channel that I've created. So the bump, the specular, the subsurface and the diffuse. And what these will allow me to do is not only will they optimize the scene where you bake them so it doesn't have to compute anything downstream to it, but you can also use these to export your textures as a flattened image. So I'm just going to go ahead and create 4 bake points for each channel I've created. And then we're going to head over to the node properties of each one. And inside of here we can export our textures. So inside of the bake point node properties, we can go on the export tab and we can pick the export path and also any format you want, such as TIFF or EXR. So we can then zoom out and look at our node graph in its entirety with all the different sections that we've created in a totally procedural fashion. So the idea of this tutorial is to create a good base texture of convincing human skin in a procedural workflow. You could go in and hand paint in other details if you wanted to. So, thanks for watching and I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial.